I still recall the moment I first set foot in Vietnam. The helicopter's roar had hardly faded before the suffocating humidity clung to my uniform, making every breath feel thick and heavy. The ground was soaked from recent downpours, and each step left me ankle-deep in mud that smelled of stale rot. I was fresh from high school, hardly old enough to see beyond a hometown horizon, yet here I was, rifle slung over one shoulder and a radio pack on the other, stepping into a war zone with a heart pounding louder than the rotor blades above. My arrival at the barracks was marked by an odor that seemed impossible to escape, a nauseating stench of sewer that lingered everywhere I turned. GIs moved past me in weary silence, their eyes haunted by experiences I could only guess at. Just the sight of their exhaustion made my stomach twist with apprehension. I tried to swallow my anxiety, reminding myself that the draft had spared me from many things back home. Except, of course, the inescapable reality of combat. The more I settled in, the more I felt that every chirp of insect life or rustle in the trees was a threat waiting to pounce. Thick foliage surrounded our camp, the jungle's shadows pressing in like a living wall. Even in daylight, visibility was poor, and the claustrophobic atmosphere heightened my unease. The weight of my radio gear seemed to double whenever I thought of the possibility that I might be cut off from the rest of our forces if something went wrong. Despite my nerves, I found a small sense of comfort in my new unit. They were not much older than I was, but they had learned fast. The men guided me through daily tasks, setting up equipment, monitoring transmissions, and adjusting frequencies to keep communications clear. With each bit of advice, they acknowledged my anxious questions without ridicule, understanding that I was trying to find my footing in a place where everything felt uncertain. As the nights wore on, rumors began to swirl of Viet Cong fighters hidden deeper in the jungle. Whispers about sudden ambushes and brutal firefights circulated through the barracks, sowing fear in even the most stoic among us. During one evening briefing, a sergeant mentioned sightings of enemy patrols nearby. The hush that followed his words was more unsettling than any thunderclap. My chest tightened as I realized I might soon face the moral consequences of a situation I had never asked for, taking another person's life. Yet, I could not afford to dwell on that fear for long. I sensed something in the air, heavier than the humidity, a feeling that a violent encounter was inevitable. My radio, meant to be a lifeline, now felt like a fragile thread holding my nerves together. By then, I understood there would be no turning back from what lay ahead. All I could do was brace myself and pray that when the time came, I would find the courage to do my duty. I remember the day of my first real firefight as though the jungle itself clung to my memory, refusing to let go. My unit was deep in the undergrowth, the trail ahead swathed in shadows cast by massive trees. The humidity pressed down on us, making every breath feel as if it might be my last. We were out on a routine patrol when somebody spotted movement. Almost instantly, gunfire erupted, the staccato bursts tearing through the hot, thick air. I dropped to my stomach, gripping the radio tight against my chest, while my heart hammered so hard it nearly drowned out every other sound. In that chaotic moment, I caught sight of the Viet Cong fighters ahead, their silhouettes flickering in the muzzle flashes. The first time I realized I might actually kill someone, my stomach lurched. Yet, there was no room for hesitation. My role was to keep the channels open, call for backup, and guide our squad through the mayhem. I tried to focus on the urgent crackle of voices through my headset. Coordinates, warnings, pleas for more ammo. When the smoke finally began to clear, I saw bodies strewn across the brush, enemy and friendly alike. The raw truth of it all made me tremble, my mind clashing between the relief of being alive and the horror of taking another person's life. After that firefight, we regrouped in camp, each of us wrestling with our own ghosts. I was picking blood-soaked leaves off my boots when a non-commissioned officer approached. Without any ceremony, he told me that Intelligence Officer Samuel Harrington needed my services. All I could do was blink, my ears still ringing from the firefight. The NCO, an older soldier with a hardened stare, said it was not a request. When I asked what Harrington wanted, the NCO simply shrugged and muttered something about critical operations. A sense of unease began to coil in my gut at the thought of leaving my unit just when I had begun to trust them. That very night, I packed my limited gear, a few personal items, my radio, and a deeply unsettled heart. My squad mates offered support the only way they could, patting me on the back and wishing me luck. A few of them seemed genuinely worried, like they knew something I did not. The older ones, men who had been around longer, looked at me with pity. I wanted to cling to their camaraderie, but the draft had taught me one thing: orders are orders. It did not take long for me to be escorted onto a sturdy truck heading farther into the wilderness. The road was nearly impassable in places, churned to sludge by heavy rains. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Vines and ferns brushed against the sides of the vehicle, and I felt like we were disappearing into the belly of something ancient and unforgiving. My grip on my radio gear tightened with each bump in the road, as if holding on to it might shield me from whatever lay ahead. When we finally halted, I climbed out to find a remote outpost surrounded by trees so dense that daylight struggled to reach the ground. Low huts were scattered between the trunks, and I caught sight of men moving with unsettling precision. They wore thick gas masks that obscured their faces, giving them an emotionless, mechanical air. The place felt devoid of any warmth or life, save for the hum of generators somewhere in the background. In that moment, I realized this assignment was going to take me far beyond the war I thought I knew. The fighting in the jungle had changed me, but I sensed that what awaited here would be far more disturbing than any firefight. When I first arrived at Officer Samuel Harrington's outpost, I could sense something was off. The huts were arranged in a tight circle, almost as if to keep prying eyes away from the center. The men in gas masks moved with a cold efficiency, their faces never visible through the dark lenses. I tried to maintain composure, but the atmosphere felt oppressive, more suffocating than the jungle itself. There was no casual conversation, no friendly banter, just an unspoken hush that gripped every corner of that hidden camp. Harrington introduced himself one evening, appearing suddenly as I sat near a flickering lantern with my radio. He was much older than most officers I had encountered, his shoulders stooped with years of service. He wore a weary expression that suggested he had seen it all. Without any small talk, he delved straight into an overview of sensitive operations and the role he needed me to fill. "Your job," he said, his voice low and measured, "is to keep our communications tight. What we do here is bigger than either of us." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a damp blanket. In the following days, I managed coded messages and intercepted enemy transmissions from a cramped makeshift station. Whenever I looked up, there always seemed to be one of those gas-masked soldiers standing at the edge of the tent, expression unreadable behind foggy lenses. At first, I assumed they were just a security detail, but the way they carried themselves suggested a far deeper purpose. They would disappear into the dense foliage or slip into one of the larger huts without making a sound. Curiosity gnawed at me, but I did not dare ask Harrington what they were doing. Something in his manner warned me to mind my own business. Despite my efforts to focus on the radio chatter, my gaze kept drifting to the largest hut situated near the center of the clearing. Strange noises drifted out from within, metal scraping, muffled hissing, the low hum of unfamiliar machinery. One evening, unable to sleep, I followed the faint glow of lights through the darkness. The tent flap was open just a sliver, and through that gap, I glimpsed something that made my stomach lurch. Inside, several severed Viet Cong heads were submerged in thick green liquid, tubes and wires sprouting from them in a horrific display. The heads twitched. Not quite alive, but not fully dead either, as if caught in some unholy limbo. I stood frozen, the scene burning itself into my mind. My senses reeled, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with any normal concept of warfare. The heads, battered and pale, seemed connected to a series of devices designed to extract information. I dared not breathe, terrified someone would notice my presence. Even in that stunned moment, I could feel my own moral compass twisting. All my previous qualms about killing on the battlefield now seemed trivial next to the gruesome cruelty in front of me. By the time I stepped away from that tent, I was trembling. Harrington found me not long after, as though he had expected me to discover his secret sooner or later. When I confronted him, my voice cracked with anger and disbelief. His face was impassive. He spoke calmly about the necessity of these experiments to gather intelligence that could save American lives. In his mind, the justification was straightforward. In mine, it was a nightmare. I stared into his eyes, trying to see some spark of doubt, but they were as cold as the gas masks worn by his loyal soldiers. That was the moment I realized I was in a place where war had become something far darker than I had ever imagined. I was at my radio station when the first explosions shattered the silence. The ground shook beneath my feet, and the canvas walls rippled with each thunderous blast. Instinct took over, and I scrambled to relay our coordinates to any friendly unit that might respond. My voice trembled as I requested immediate support, but static overwhelmed my headset, punctuated only by frantic bursts of rifle fire. Outside, figures darted past, some wearing gas masks, others in tattered uniforms. It was impossible to tell friend from foe in the flickering chaos of muzzle flashes. My heart pounded so hard I thought my ribs might crack. Darkness and confusion reigned. As I stepped outside the tent, I saw at least 2 huts consumed by flames, the oily smoke clawing at the sky. Shouts in broken English mingled with orders barked by the gas-masked soldiers. Then I felt a tremendous pressure in my head, a flash of searing light, and everything faded into a deep, suffocating night. The last thing I recalled was the acrid taste of smoke on my tongue. I awoke with bandages strapped around my arm and head, unsure of how much time had passed. The air was stagnant, though the surroundings looked cleaner, more structured than the jungle outpost. A nurse explained I was in a field hospital, found unconscious after the outpost attack. My injuries were severe enough that they had me sedated for days. When I asked after Harrington, the specialized soldiers in that gruesome tent, she gave me a bewildered look, as though unsure whether I was feverish or simply delirious. Over the following days, I pressed every medic and officer I could find for information. Most claimed ignorance. A few said the outpost I described was never listed as an official installation. One soldier mentioned rumors of an operation falling under high-level secrecy, but his tone suggested he wanted nothing to do with it. Each dead end only fueled my questions. My memories of severed Viet Cong heads suspended in green liquid felt like a nightmare that refused to fade with the morning light. I tried to make sense of it all. Whenever I attempted to piece together events, my mind came up blank. The moments leading up to the attack were clear. My confrontation with Harrington, my horror at what I saw in that tent, but the actual assault was now a haze. All I had were disjointed flashes of orange flames, masked soldiers rushing in unison, and that crushing blow to my skull. In place of answers, I found only silence, as though the entire operation had vanished into the thick jungle undergrowth. Even after I was sent to a safer post for the remainder of my tour, the memory of what I saw haunted me. At night, I would drift off only to jolt awake, convinced I heard the electric hum of machinery or caught a whiff of that rancid chemical odor. Sometimes I imagined Harrington's voice telling me the ends justified the means, daring me to ask if I agreed. In truth, I never found my footing again. Long after the war ended, I carried that secret with me, an unshakable sense that behind the official reports and folded flags, there remained corners of conflict far darker than anyone dared admit.